Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today I've got a special guest. I've got Dr. Stephen M Barr. He's a Catholic, a physicist and author. He wrote the book Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, which makes a strong case that science does not, in fact, contradict religion, but in many ways vindicates it. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me on, Arjun.
It's a pleasure. I'm a big fan of your work.
Well, thank you.
Had your work recommended to me. So one thing I've been wanting to talk to you about, seeing as you're a physicist and, us non-physicists can only speculate about these things, but there's this thing called strong emergence. I think David Chalmers came up with the term. And I believe you argue that consciousness would be strong emergence, and the cases of emergence we have in physics don't demonstrate strong emergence. Could you say something about that?
Correct. I'm not sure exactly how strong emergence would be defined, but I would say this. I think emergence is sort of looking at reductionism in the other direction. So if you say B emerges from A, that to me says that B is reducible to A. I don't think that consciousness, a lot of things can be reduced to physics. I am a physicist, and I actually tend to be fairly reductionist in my views when it comes to inanimate or non-sentient, not just inanimate, but anything that's non-sentient. I tend to think, I'm not dogmatic about this, but I tend to think it can be reduced to physics. Or to put it another way, that it emerges from physics. I do not think that is true when it comes to mind, however. And the reason I would draw a distinction between two, what I would call physical, what can be reduced to physics, or physical reductionism, and let me explain how things do emerge from physics or can be reduced to physics. In physics, you have essentially, as physics as we've understood it for the last 300 or 400 years, is essentially about equations. It's about mathematical rules that govern the universe. And when you explain something in physics, ultimately what you're doing, if you explain some effect or phenomenon in physics, ultimately, what you're doing is showing that effect or phenomenon follows from the equations of physics. It follows from the mathematical laws of physics. And I think that when it comes to the inanimate and even the non-sentient world, you can, I believe it could be shown that everything we see there does follow from the mathematical laws of physics. But I don't think consciousness does follow from the laws of physics. It doesn't follow from the equations. And so I would definitely draw the line there.
So the way I've understood it is for emergence that's explainable from physics, you could predict it, right? So you give all the right physical parameters, and somebody who has a sufficient degree of knowledge would predict the emergent property.
Correct. I think when it comes to, say copper, or something like that, if you want to understand, if you know the values of the fundamental variables that would describe a piece of copper, and you know the relevant laws of physics, which we do actually, you could show that the properties of copper, such as it's a good conductor of electricity, or that it's shiny, or that it has a certain melting point, and so forth and so on. All the physical properties and behavior of copper could be shown to follow from the equations of physics, and an exhaustive mathematical description of the structure of copper. So yes, I think that's correct. If you know the physical state, if you have an exhaustive mathematical description of the structure of some physical entity, and you know the relevant equations, then I would say all the properties and behavior of that follow.
So if a physicist had never seen copper before, never measured it, never played with it, but they had all the relevant knowledge, and
Mhm.
you told them the chemical structure of copper and how it's produced, and they'd be able to tell you its properties.
Yeah, you don't have to. All you'd have to know is, it's some configuration of copper nuclei and electrons, and if you knew what that configuration was, and you know the laws, basically all you need to know are the laws of quantum electrodynamics, which we do know, then the properties of copper follow from that. Well, almost all of them. Then, of course, there are nuclear properties, so you'd have to know more of the laws of physics than quantum electrodynamics. You'd have to know more about the laws of governing the strong interactions. But if you knew all the laws of physics, all the properties of copper would flow from them, in my view, and I think the view of the great majority of physicists. So in that sense, yes, that the properties of copper or any other inanimate physical thing, and I would even say plants, you know, uh, non-sentient living things, I would say that they follow from the laws of physics necessarily, logically, and mathematically.
I like to draw a distinction between qualia and physical properties. So often people will argue that, water is an emergent property. You combine hydrogen and oxygen together, you get water, and it's got this property called wetness that neither hydrogen nor oxygen have. And I say, well, with the physics, we can fully explain wetness. It's just a variation in bonding properties. Is that accurate?
Right. Yeah, in fact, it's kind of funny. I was at a conference once in Chicago about 15 years ago, and there was a quite eminent philosopher who was giving a talk. He was the guest of honor at the dinner, and he was giving a talk later that evening. And I won't say his name. I have great respect for him, but he said at the dinner that the properties of water don't follow from the fact that it's H2O or that the molecule, knowing that it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen and so on. And I said, actually, it does. The properties of water do flow from that. In fact, someone at my university, I'm now retired, but one of my colleagues in the University of Delaware physics department, a Polish physicist, and his colleagues in Poland have done massive computer calculations. It takes very, very powerful computers to simulate the properties of water, of a tiny droplet of water of, I don't know how many, maybe it was hundreds of water molecules. And they just simulated, from the equations of physics on a computer, how this little drop of hundreds of water molecules would behave. And not only did they simulate what things we knew about water, but they discovered things about water that were not known before. For example, no one had known in liquid water how many other water molecules are touching or next to a given water molecule. How do they fit together in the water? This was not really known, but the simulation gave the answer to that. So actually, we can determine the properties of water from the laws of physics and the fact that it's made of molecules of H2O. But as you say, wetness, what do you mean by wetness? If you mean by wetness some property that inheres in the water itself, something about the behavior of the water itself, then yes, we can understand that from physics. But if you mean by wetness the sensation of wetness that we have when we are wet and get out of the shower, or our hands are wet, no, that doesn't come from physics. I think maybe an easier qualium, or qualia, I don't know what the singular is. An easier case to talk about would be color. So take the color red. What do we mean by the color red? Well, there's red light, and we know if somebody said, can you explain to me why this coffee cup is, well, I guess it's red, or an apple is red? At one level, yes, because red light, what we call red light, is a certain range of wavelengths of light, of electromagnetic waves. And physics can explain why the skin of an apple would preferentially reflect light of those wavelengths. It could explain what happens when light of those wavelengths enters our eye, and what happens when they interact with the cone cells in our retinas, and what happens when signals are sent up the optic nerves, and in principle, what happens in the visual cortex of our brains, and so forth. And at that level, yes, it could explain not only redness, but how it is that we can distinguish things that are red from things that are yellow or green. But that is not telling you anything about what the color that we see, the psychological phenomenon or the mental phenomenon, the subjective experience of redness. So, so what do you mean by the red? If you mean, I would say the apple has a property that you could call redness that is essentially, that has to do with how it interacts with electromagnetic waves or with light. How does the apple interact with light? That's an inherent property of the apple, a physical property of the apple, and that we can explain from physics. But what we perceive as the sensation of redness, that doesn't come out of the equations. You can't, nor what a rose smells like, or what bacon tastes like, and so forth, and things like that, or what some those don't come out of the equations. You can't. And as I said to somebody, I think my dog, my late dog, he died about a year ago. My dog Sparky loved bacon, and as all dogs do, and he loved breakfast sausages and other things. I'm pretty confident that he had taste sensations, that he had consciousness, that he experienced qualia. But if I were to deny that, I wouldn't be contradicting anything that we know from the laws of physics and chemistry. It in no way would contradict the laws of physics and chemistry to deny that Sparky had, that he was conscious, that he had any subjective experiences. Those just don't come out of the equations.
Yeah, well, I guess part of it is you can't explain why a certain light frequency produces red and not yellow, and another one produces yellow and not red. It doesn't follow.
Or why it produces right. I mean, there's no way, for example, if you came across we can sort of imagine, if you come across some life form you don't know anything about, maybe on a distant planet, or even on this planet, as the philosopher, I think it was Thomas Nagel, said, what is it like to be a bat and to see by echolocation? Or what does some other species of animal, what are its subjective experiences like? You can't solve an equation and answer that question. You can't even solve an equation. Is a fish conscious? Is a shark conscious? You can't answer. You could know everything there was to know about the physical structure down to the subatomic level of a fish, and you can know all the laws of physics. You can't get out of that those equations and that mathematical description. You can't get any conclusion about whether the shark or the fish has any sort of consciousness. It just doesn't follow mathematically or logically any conclusion.
This comes to a point that someone needs to tell the new atheists about, which is that some of these claims are simply not the domain of science. You can neither prove them nor disprove them using empirical methods.
You see, in a way, I don't see this as directly a religious question. I mean, now I'm neither a Western skeptic nor an Eastern. What did you say?
Eastern theology.
Theology. I'm Western theology, yeah. So I'm not. That is, even if I were somehow to lose my faith in God, that God exists, I would still regard it as very mysterious. That I would find consciousness and everything pertaining to it very mysterious and not explicable from physics. I think this cuts across. This is a question. There are atheist philosophers like Thomas Nagel, I think David Chalmers, whom you mentioned, and others, who regard this as deeply mysterious and would agree that consciousness and qualia do not simply follow from the laws of physics. So they're atheists, but they're not physicalists. My view is that consciousness, if we're just talking about, say, the consciousness of animals, and our consciousness to the extent that it is like that of animals, I think that is a natural phenomenon. I do think so. If you have certain configurations of matter, certain neural structures, it seems that certain mental phenomena follow from that as a consequence. We know that if you increase or decrease the concentration of certain molecules in the brain, like serotonin, certain mental phenomena follow from that in a predictable way. I've read in a book, I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's a certain cluster of cells in the human brain. I think it's called V4. And if you damage or destroy them, you lose color vision. And so those are predictable mental consequences, as it were, of physical changes. So that tells me there's some sort of natural causation there. Certain physical phenomena have naturally caused certain mental phenomena. I'm just saying it's not physical causation. It's natural, but it's not physics causation, because, as I said, in physics, to say that A causes B means that B follows inevitably, logically, mathematically from A through the equations of physics. And so that's physical. That's the kind of causation that physicists can understand as physicists. And so whatever this natural causation, so I think consciousness is a natural phenomenon. It's a part of the natural world. It's just, it's natural, but it is not explicable by physical causation. Causation as physicists, that the laws of physics can account for. So even if I'm an atheist, I just think consciousness shows that physicalism is wrong, that everything is physics. I don't think it says anything directly about whether God exists, or whether there's anything beyond nature. So I want to make that clear. There are probably people out there who, I think a lot of people resist the idea that consciousness transcends physics, because they think that by saying that, you're saying that it's something, well, to put it pejoratively, magical about it, or supernatural about it, or miraculous about it, rather than it being a natural phenomenon. And so they resist that, because they don't want to say anything that sounds, like they're abandoning a naturalistic view of things. But so that's why I want to emphasize, you don't have to abandon the naturalistic view to agree that consciousness transcends physics.
Well, what do we mean by the word natural? Like, I think in many cases, replacing the word natural with unconscious would be more accurate. It was unconscious processes gave rise to this, or the unconscious laws of physics. And in many philosophical cases, you'd be more explicit about what you're saying if the word naturalism was replaced with that.
Yeah, I have to say the word natural is a very tricky one, and in different contexts it means different things. So maybe I shouldn't have dragged that in. But
it's worth clarifying.
I would say that you begin to talk about, let's say, the spiritual is now the classic Christian view, certainly the Catholic view, and I believe this really is the Christian view for the last 2,000 years, is that when you say that a being is spiritual, you are saying that it has reason and free will. Those are the powers of the human person that have been traditionally identified as our spiritual powers, reason and free will. And the traditional view, which I share, is that of terrestrial creatures, we don't, whether they're extraterrestrials out there who have reason and free will, we don't know. But of terrestrial creatures, only human beings have reason and free will, and only we are spiritual beings, and thus made in the image of God. So that's where I think, and now see, I think reason and free will really are transcend not only physics, but they really go beyond. And I don't know what word to use. The natural. I think the Catholic view, which of course I share, is that they are in some sense a special endowment conferred upon human beings by God. That nature left to itself, let's put it this way, if God didn't specially act in the case of each individual human being, when the human being comes into this world, God did not specially act and just left nature to its course, reason and free will would not appear. The spirit, our spiritual nature, we wouldn't have a spiritual nature. So I think that's where I think you touch really more on questions pertaining to God and religion.
Yeah, that's getting into theology.
Not with the mere consciousness that a dog has, but with our spiritual side.
But the Eastern idea is a bit different. We understand that there's the same spark of consciousness in every living entity, and we can reincarnate in any variety of life forms. So the fact that animals don't possess the same reasoning faculties we do is simply because of the capacity afforded them by the body they're in.
Well, certainly the body isn't. Yes, certainly what the medievals would have called, you have to have apt matter, so that God is omnipotent, but you wouldn't have a rational soul, that is a spiritual soul, in a frog, because it doesn't have the neural substrate to support that, or a worm, or a tree. You have to have certain, there have to be certain preconditions there to be able to have a spiritual soul.
You could have
one has to be a little bit careful about that, I suppose, because then the question arises: when in the life of a human being does it receive a spiritual soul? And that's been debated historically by Catholic theologians. But yes, certainly the body. The body is not irrelevant to this. Let's put it that way. I agree. But yeah, so this is probably a difference between a clear difference between the Eastern, there's at least a certain class of Eastern.
The metaphysics are quite different between the two traditions.
And the Western view. Now, I do think certainly the consciousness, non-rational consciousness, clearly has some connection with rationality. I don't believe you could have a rational free being who is not conscious. So I mean, I think as part of the process by which we made our appearance in this world, we first had to develop. Evolution had to produce not only living things but conscious beings. The consciousness is certainly a step on the way to rationality and freedom. I don't think you can have a rational and free creature who is not conscious. But consciousness is only a step to it. It's not the whole thing. It's reason and freedom go beyond just consciousness.
I think
now
Sir Roger Penrose gave an interesting definition of consciousness. He said this is one thing that he can easily understand is understanding. So a computer can follow rules. You give it a set, it can follow the rules, whereas a conscious entity, you can give it that set of rules and it can understand things based on those rules, but which don't follow from the rules, and that's understanding. So if animals could demonstrate this kind of thing, then that could be proof they're conscious, perhaps.
There's different kinds of understanding, let's say knowledge. So, and I think people conflate them. So there is a certain sense, and we anthropomorphize even a chess playing program or something. We would say, the program doesn't know, that it's about to be checkmated. Well, nowadays it probably does, because the chess playing computers are so powerful. But we anthropomorphize. But let's talk about. Let's leave machines out of the discussion for a moment. A dog certainly has a form of knowledge. It's not rational knowledge. It's more knowledge on the level of sensation and association. So a dog will know that its food bowl is there, or that its master has come home, and so on. A dog will look at a squirrel and know that's a squirrel, or know that it maybe that's a bird. But it's not the way we know something is a squirrel or a bird. The dog knows at the level of sensory knowledge and associates things. So if my dog, when he was alive, if he heard the rattling of dishes in the kitchen, he associated that sound with the experience of food being available. So I think a lot of their knowledge is association, is just association. But the dog can't say that is a squirrel, or that is my food bowl, because it doesn't have the concept, doesn't have the abstract concept of a bowl or of food or or squirrel. It doesn't. It doesn't, and it doesn't have language. It not only can it not form propositions. The knowledge of a dog is not propositional knowledge. It's not. It doesn't have not just propositions in the sense of a form of words that are uttered or written, but even in the sense of sort of pre-verbal propositions that are made of concepts that might be at a deeper level of the mind before they're verbalized. But it doesn't have conceptual knowledge. It doesn't say, yes, that is true, or no, that is false. Even to say there's a bird sitting on the bough of that tree, that involves many abstract concepts: tree, branch or bough, bird, sitting. Those are all abstractions. And to say there is a bird sitting on the branch of that tree is a proposition. It's either true or false. That's not the way a dog knows. So we have that non-rational knowledge too. We know things at a non-rational level. You stick my hand in a flame, there's a sense in which I know my finger is hot before I conceptualize it. But we also have a level, as it were, that dogs don't have. And that's rational knowledge. And I would say all rational knowledge ultimately comes from making a well-grounded affirmation of the truth of a proposition. When you have made a judgment when your mind has made a judgment that a certain proposition is true, then you have a knowledge that you didn't have before. You have additional rational knowledge of the world, and that is something I don't believe animals have. They don't make judgments of truth and falsehood.
I think we're in agreement on what the differences are between us and animals. We just disagree over what the cause is. So the Eastern view is kind of like that this reality is, you could almost call it a simulation hypothesis. So we enter into these bodies and we have our senses, our faculties are restricted or enhanced in certain ways based on the body. So if you take an animal body, then you get restricted in that way. And when you're in a human body, then you have this extra reasoning faculty, which is absent in animals. So animals are kind of pushed around by their nature. So, trying to survive and trying to eat, they've all their desires. They're just basically following those. Whereas humans, we have this thing you could call free won't. We have this ability to say, no, I'm not going to act on this urge. I'm going to act on my intellect.
I think we also have free will. But I go along with you. In fact, we're getting to a kind of a tricky question for Catholic theology. So I'm going to be very frank here. I'm not going to try to hide anything. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, a lot of Catholics don't realize this, even the ones who are relatively knowledgeable. And I didn't realize it until I did some reading recently. In the Middle Ages, under the influence of Aristotle, some of the scholastic theologians would have said that in the development of a human being in the womb, it goes through stage. So they distinguished the Aristotelians, and I think this is between things that are inanimate, things that have a vegetative soul, like a plant, then things which, in addition to having the life, the vegetative soul, they had sensation, so they had a sensitive soul. And then above that, things which, in addition to sensation, had reason, so they had a rational soul. There were sort of four layers to the world. And they thought that in the womb, that the unborn child went through first having a vegetative soul, because it didn't yet have the machinery there for sensation. Then it would have a sensitive soul at a further level of development, and then at a further level, a rational soul. And the reason they thought that, now some Catholics nowadays are under the impression that it was just because they were slavishly following Aristotle, but actually they weren't just slavishly following Aristotle. They were following the logic, a certain logic, which is you can't have, they would argue, you can't have a rational soul unless you have what they would have called the apt material, the materia apta. That is matter that is capable of receiving a rational soul. Which we would, in modern terms, say the neural machinery that you need to have reason. And you can't have sensation. You can't have a sensitive soul, they would have argued. And again, they didn't know anything about neurons and things, but you can't have a sensitive soul, they would have said, unless you have the matter organized in such a way that it's capable of sensation. Again, the apt matter, materia apta. And so I think that actually was the prevailing view for a long time. Nowadays, Catholic theologians generally say, and I think I share this view, it's not a matter of doctrine. It's not a article of faith, but it is the general teaching of theologians, or belief, that the instant that a new human life comes into being, which would be a conception, and that's just a biological question. It is clearly a new life, and it's human, so it's a human being. That at that point, the rational soul, the spiritual soul, is already present. And I tend to agree with that. But that does raise an interesting question. You have a rational soul, but you don't have a physical, substrate that would allow, for example, reasoning. By the way, rationality doesn't mean sitting and making syllogisms and mathematical proofs. A lot. I think a little baby, has even a little baby is a rational being, even though it can't talk yet, and even though it certainly couldn't formulate an argument. But anyway, it is an interesting question in how there can be a rational soul when the human being is, say, a cluster of 8 cells. And I have nothing to say about that. I do all I know empirically, not empirically, but all I can sort of know from experience is that past a certain age, I know that this being has reason. You have reason, I have reason. A small child has reason, maybe a 7-year-old, and that tells me that there's something about them that goes beyond just the capacities of matter. That there is a spiritual soul there. Extrapolating back to closer to the beginning of its existence as a human being, then you get into a very murky area where we really have no empirical grounds for saying anything about the spiritual soul. But
yeah, I mean, some of that's getting into theology, which means science isn't going to answer these questions, and we'll have various theological differences, and those get resolved in theological territory. I wasn't actually planning on going down this road.
Maybe there's a philosophical way to resolve it, but
yeah, possibly.
Anyway, you're right. Physics and biology know nothing about spiritual souls anyhow, so they're certainly not going to tell us when they make their appearance. So,
but we can agree that they're all. Sorry, yeah, you go.
So I don't know anything much about Eastern religion. I mean, I know as much as the next man, I suppose, the next Western man. So souls, there's reincarnation, at least in some Eastern religions, and soul, when you die, your soul can become reincarnated even in a lower animal, and so on. And what is that governed by some set of laws or rules, or is there some authority in charge of that determines is there, I won't say God, but some being who himself has will, who decides, okay, you're going into a frog, and by, so let's say, divine power makes that happen? Or is it something that's sort of a system that goes along on its own by some sort of rules?
It's a combination of the two. So there's basic principles that determine where you go, but then the decisions are actually made by people. The people are empowered representatives of God who are doing this service. And so there's a conception of, so I'm a Hare Krishna, which is an Eastern theology formerly known as Chaitanya Vaishnavism. And so there's even some description of hells, but they're brief in duration. And, so various kinds of sinful activity will warrant certain kinds of punishment. But the trips to hell are extremely short, although the experience is long while there. And the body you get in your next life is determined by your state of consciousness at the time of death. So whatever you're most absorbed in and meditating on, and also, how you've lived your life. So if somebody's, obsessed with eating meat and whatnot, then they can take birth as a tiger or a lion.
Well, I was curious. It's something I've always wondered about. I'm not going to drag the conversation into an exploration of your views, because your listeners, I'm sure, have heard a lot about your views, and they're probably more curious. I may be more of a strange phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of people who aren't Hare Krishnas following the channel, so that is a good opportunity for them to learn.
Okay.
If you have more questions, you're welcome to ask.
Okay. All right. No, I have a lot of questions, but I think you have had me on the show so that you can.
Well, we can do another one where you can pry into our religion. Back to the wetness thing. So I think the wetness argument gets a lot of traction because people conflate the qualia with the physics, and they think, you add these two things together and bam, you get this weird thing called wetness that wasn't there before. And they're not really distinguishing between the qualia and the physics. So the physics we can fully explain, but the qualia we can't. Because they conflate the two in their head, the argument seems more impressive than it is if you actually drill down into it.
Okay. What do you mean by wetness in this context?
Well, the word wetness can mean both things, right? Like wetness, if you look for, I don't know if there's a technical physics definition of wetness that's used by scientists, or if they have other terms they use to describe what we might call wetness in a physical context. But the word also describes a qualia.
Because I have read, I have not immersed myself in the philosophical literature on philosophy of mind, but I'm aware of the term qualia and things, but could you explain a little more just for my benefit? Because I'm sort of been left in the dust here.
Well, from a physics point of view, I would think of wetness as a variation in binding characteristics. I mean, could you give a quick description of what wetness would be from a physics angle?
Instead, I don't even know what.
It's the tendency to form weak bonds. So you get the
assertion.
Sorry,
the word witness, and I can figure out what you mean by it. But I mean, you haven't said anything. You haven't made any claims about using this concept of witness. So I'm not sure what you're driving.
Well, I'd say it has two different meanings. One is as it describes a qualia. So wetness is the sensation of something that is wet, or of becoming wet. And the difference between something that feels dry and something that feels wet.
Things froze.
I can still hear you.
I think
it's.
Sorry, I lost you for a while there.
Okay. Yeah, you're back.
Okay.
I've got to fix your image. Maybe I can just do that for now. So.
I'm sorry. I hope I didn't do something wrong.
No, well, you're fine. I've just got to. Let's see. I'll go here. So I was explaining about so wetness. I think the word could be taken in two different meanings. So it's an equivocation problem that we can use the word to mean two separate things. One is a qualia, to describe a qualia, and the other is to describe a physical. Oh no, that's not what we want. Oh, hang on. Sorry, that's playing that. Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties. And one is to describe a. Oh, hang on. No, I'm still having problems.
Now I'm big. No, this is probably good enough.
Let's see if that works.
Viewers might appreciate not seeing.
Oh, isn't? Oh, I see what's
I'll
going
move
on.
over. I can move to the side.
I can change which. Yeah, okay. So one is to describe the physical characteristics of wetness. You've changed your frame a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I think there's the same sort of equivocation with the much used word information.
Oh, the information's a good one to get into, actually.
Yeah, so information, people. There's a lot of equivocation goes on with people who are materialists who try to pretend that something like consciousness doesn't exist, and so they'll talk about information, but at one level, information is something you can have there in an inanimate system. You could talk about how much information it would take you to completely describe what was going on in a glass of water, right? It's just a set of numbers or something. Why don't you leave it there and let me just shift
I'm just getting it tidy. I've nearly got it.
Okay. All right, but it's easier for me just to move my chair slightly.
Oh, I was trying to get the size right. Okay, there we go. No, sort of.
It's all relative, right? No, I mean, so if you say how much information does it require to describe what's going on in this glass of water? Well, you can say there's so many bits of information. There Avogadro's number, maybe there's 10 to the 26 or 10 to the 28 molecules in this water, and each of them move. It takes a certain amount of data to completely describe, or a certain amount of quantitative numerical data to describe the glass of water. But that's all. But then, is somebody being informed by that? Information also has the connotation that some body, some mind, is being informed. So I could have a newspaper there. In a certain sense, it has a lot of information in it. But if everybody in the world died, it really wouldn't be information, because there would be nobody to be informed by it. So I think that kind of equivocation is rampant. And as you say, with qualia, but with qualia, it's a different. Well, it's related, obviously. There's the physical characteristics, and then there are the mental phenomena that are caused by those physical characteristics, and those are distinct. It's kind of funny. I've talked to people who are very bright. There are people it seems that people either see the distinction between, say, red as a physical property of things and red as the sensation, or they don't. And if they don't see it right away, you can talk to them for 3 hours and they'll never see it. I talked to a guy who's not a materialist. He's actually a devout Catholic. And I was arguing with him on my back porch, and he was saying physics could explain the color red. And I kept trying to get across to him, there's the color red in the sense of wavelengths of light, or even what's going on in the brain, in the visual cortex, but that's not the sensation of color. I couldn't get him to see the distinction even in an hour. And I was talking to a very bright graduate student from mainland China some years ago at a conference. And I spoke to him for probably 45 minutes, and he could never. He would say, "We do understand, we do understand what pain is. Pain." He identified pain, the sensation of pain for him is the same as all of the stuff that was going on in the brain and the body, which is associated with pain. I mean, he couldn't see there was a distinction between them. And I just have given up trying to explain this distinction to people, because, as I said, my experience is that either they immediately grasp what you're saying, or it's somehow it doesn't somehow fit into their mental categories, and they just don't get it.
Right.
So I don't know, it's frustrating. I don't know if you've had the same
Yeah, I
experience.
get what you're saying. Along that same note, I find it funny how people say, the hard problem of consciousness and this and that, and we still don't even have a definition of consciousness, so we haven't really even defined the problem. It's like, well, we all know what consciousness is. I mean, that what do they mean when they say we
Exactly.
haven't got a definition of consciousness? Is I don't have something that I can measure and plot into an equation.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the last refuge of a scoundrel, if I may use an expression, borrow it from another context. That's the way people who have very reductive ways of thinking try to silence you, is by saying they profess not to know what you're even referring to. So physics explains everything. Well, it doesn't explain consciousness. Well, then they affect not to understand what consciousness is. But of course, that's the only thing we first know, as one famous physicist once said. The only thing we know directly is, I know my sweet, my green, and so on. Everything else is a theory. So our subjective experiences are the most real things. They're the things we know and cannot be wrong about.
Mhm.
What in the extramental world, and I don't know if this is a category that would fit in with Eastern thinking, but there's the mind, but there's the world outside the mind. There's the extramental world, and we first know our sensations and our mental, but we infer everything that's outside our mind. So I can't be wrong that I'm seeing the color red, that I'm having a red sensation. If I'm having it, I know I'm having it. I don't have to justify that.
Well,
I might be wrong about what's causing it. It could be that the red sensation I'm having is caused by my looking at an apple, and then the red light gets reflected off the apple, and blah blah blah. Or it could be that somebody stuck an electrode in my brain and stimulated the visual cortex electrically and made that red sensation appear. And I may be wrong in my theory of what in the extramental world caused the red sensation, but there's no way I can be wrong that I'm having a sensation of red. That's a direct experience. These people are sort of upside down.
yeah.
As I said in the book, we know we have minds, and we infer that we have brains. It's not that the brain infers that it has a mind. The mind infers that there's a brain.
Yeah, right.
We're not. They have it completely upside down.
I was reading Donald Hoffman's book, A Case Against Reality, where he argues that evolution has crafted our senses to be fitness seeking. So all of our perceptions of color and time and space and sensation, they don't tell us what objective reality is actually like. They're just a heuristic that our brains use to survive. But looking at that, I think there's another quote in the book where he quotes Wittgenstein, where he was discussing with another lady academic, and they were talking about whether the sun orbits the Earth, or the Earth's stationary and the sun's moving, it's like she was saying, well, back then they were just came to the assumption based on what things look like, and the Wittgenstein said back, well, what would it have looked like for the sun to move and the Earth be stationary? And that really made her
Same.
That's the same. So, in the same way with Donald Hoffman's point about our perceptions of this world not really telling us what objective reality is actually like. It's like, well, what would it look like for our perceptions to just be something our brains have crafted versus our perceptions to be something that's intended for us to perceive, and this world is actually meant to give us those experiences. So the experience is actually the most foundational thing, and the physics behind it all is just kind of like the woodwork that makes it all happen. The behind the scenes that makes it all possible.
I would agree with him. Is this Hoffman who was saying all this?
Hoffman was
not read the names.
Hoffman makes the point about our senses being heuristics rather than accurate.
I actually agree with Hoffman up to a point. I haven't read him, so I may agree with him entirely. But so, yes, I think there are certain, let's say, heuristics. nature has equipped us with sensation, and also with a certain, well, like animal, take a dog. A dog doesn't have rational knowledge, but it does have a certain relatively reliable knowledge about the world and how it works, through sensation and through association of one thing with another and so forth, and some instinctive knowledge. And even human beings, it's been shown that little babies, have actually know things about how the physical world works that they could not have derived from experience, given how little experience they had. So there is actually in human beings a certain amount of understanding that's sort of innate about certain features of how the physical world works. But I agree that that is not completely reliable. I mean, yes, we know we're having certain sensory experiences, but that does not immediately tell us how things outside our minds really are in themselves. That tells us how they appear to us. To really know how things are in themselves, things outside the mind or extramental things are in themselves, we need rational knowledge. And so the stick in the water may appear bent, to use the classic example, but our reason can operate, and we can come to the conclusion by investigation and rational inquiry. We can come to the conclusion that no, the stick is not in itself bent. That's the appearance of that is caused by the fact that water has a certain refractive index and all this kind of thing, and the way the light is refracted by the water as it passes from the water to the air. And when we have rational knowledge, so I really think that our knowledge of the world outside our minds, as it is in itself, as things are in themselves, and their true relationships to each other, that comes through rational knowledge. And that, if it's arrived at by properly using our rational faculties, by properly using them and not making a mistake, that's reliable knowledge in a way that sensation is not. So I sort of agree with him. Nature has given us this rough and ready, the same equipment that a dog has, in a sense. It allows us most of the time to navigate our way around the world. When you're riding a bicycle, you don't have to use your reason. A lot of it's muscle memory and stuff. A lot of our understanding of how the world works and what will happen if I do this and so on. That a lot of that happens at the non-rational level and at the level really that an animal has. And so I would sort of agree with him on that. So a dog is never going to understand what is causing. He's never going to understand. He might see the squirrel, but he's never going to understand what the squirrel is, what it's made of, why it does what it does, and so on. Or why it looks like it looks, and all that kind of the animal. So the dog is trapped at a very rudimentary level of knowledge about the world outside its mind.
The point I was getting at is that, like the Eastern view, the Vaishnava view is that this world is meant to deliver sensory experiences to living entities to teach us certain lessons. It's kind of like a soul building, or you could even call it a kind of purgatory to purify our hearts and elevate us in love of God. So from that view, even though this table is actually mostly empty space, it's still accurate to say actually the reality of it is that it's a physical hard object, because that's the phenomenology that we experience of it, and that's what's intended for us to experience. And all the physics that gives rise to that is just kind of the behind the scenes stuff that, so to say the mechanism that gives rise to the physical property is more real than the qualia of the property is kind of an upside down way of looking at it.
And also, no, see, I think they're distinct things. So the sensation, the qualia, the subjective experience is a real thing. If I am having a red sensation, see, people are confused because they're mixing up. They have there's this expression, it's all in your mind. And there's an equivocation there too. One way of using that expression is to say it's all in your mind, meaning that you're giving a description of the reality outside your mind, and the picture that you have of it in your mind does not correspond to reality. So if I think that I'm the king of France, well, in reality, I'm not the king of France. Or if I think that I'm sitting on the moon, in reality, I'm not sitting on the moon, but in my mind, I am. And so people associate the expression "it's in your mind" with saying it's not real, it's false, or it's somehow unreal. But my thoughts are in my mind, and my subjective experiences of my sensations of redness, or my concepts, my ideas are in my mind. That doesn't mean they're not real. If I have a sensation of redness, that sensation is a real sensation. It's going on in a real place, my mind. It's not, I either am having a sensation of redness or I'm not. There's a fact of the matter. It's an aspect of objective reality that I'm having a red sensation. So I would say, yes, some things are mental phenomena and they're real, but they're not. And then there are physical phenomena and they're real and they're related to each other in some way. But I don't think that the redness of this cup, if you call it red, maybe the redness of this cup as a physical property, that is the aspect of this cup that makes it preferentially reflect light of certain wavelengths. That's a real. But my sensation of redness is equally real. They're different. They're distinct. But they're equally real.
I'd say they're distinct qualities that are tied in with one another.
Yes, they're tied in the sense that the way I'm structured, certain things in the extramental world affect my sense organs, and all that's physics, all the way up to the impulses traveling up the optic nerves and so on and so forth. All that's happening is physical. And then at the end, somehow, a sensation of redness arises in my mind, and that's real. And the mysterious thing is how the previous things that went on, they're all describable by physics, cause the mental phenomenon, which is real, which is not described by physics or not accounted for by physics. But I'm not, I don't know. So consciousness is an aspect of the real world, and the things that are in consciousness, including my acts of will, an act of understanding. If I understand something, if I understand the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, or I understand some moral concept, that act of understanding is a real act. It exists, and it's just as real as something physical.
So what would you think about the idea that the physical properties are simply something like, we could give an analogy that they're like an algorithm to determine what kind of qualitative experiences will be delivered depending on what kind of inputs are there?
Well, it's easier to be an idealist in the philosophical sense than a materialist. That is, one could take the position. I don't think I wouldn't take this position. I don't think it's an absurd position, to say that what is ultimately real are conscious experiences of various conscious beings, and the physical world is simply, as you say, maybe an algorithm that relates some conscious experiences to other conscious experiences. I mean, it sort of works that way in quantum mechanics, where you observe certain things, then you calculate, and it tells you what you're going to observe next time. Right? And so, I mean, one could go down the Berkeleyan path and say, well, that really ultimately, what do I mean to say there's a coffee cup here? It means that it's a theoretical structure. It's a theoretical way of explaining my sensations and your sensations.
Well, the Vaishnava view is that there's an actual material energy but it's said that it's a Shakti, so an energy of God, and it has certain properties. It behaves in a certain way and interacts in a certain way. So it's not exactly idealism, I'd say, I think it would be odd to call it that. It's described that there's an ontological category of material energy.
I'm sort of a dualist, though. That's a fighting. That's kind of a word that has many meanings, and some of them are some forms of dualism a Catholic could not accept. So it's a dangerous word to use because, as I said, it has many different meanings. But I think there's both. I think matter is real. I think mind is real, and I think neither is reducible to the other. But if I had to choose a sort of monism, I think that it's easier to see how matter can arise from mind than it is to see how mind can arise from matter.
Yeah.
So if you look at what is physical stuff, well, you might say, there's some kind of take a bronze ball, and you say, well, there's matter there, and that's bronze, and then there's some spherical shape. Well, that's a mathematical form, the sphericity of it, a sphere. So you have form, which is mathematics, and you have stuff, which is not mathematics, which is the bronze. Until you look and you find the bronze is made up of various atoms, and the atoms, and then, well, you could say, well, bronze is a structure which is describable mathematically, consisting of certain nuclei and certain electrons, and you can describe how those are structured mathematically. And then you say, well, it's a nucleus. Well, it's quarks and gluons, and it's made of those structured in a certain way. And you keep going down and down and down. At the end of the day, what you end up being left with in physics is just the mathematical form. If you get down to the rock bottom, and we don't know what the rock bottom is, it could be superstrings. But let's take the standard model of particle physics as we have it today, our present most fundamental theory, and let's just assume for the sake of argument, what is almost certainly not true, that it is the ultimate theory of physics, the ultimate description of the world. In that theory, if you ask what is an electron made of, it's not like there's a stuff there. The electron is really ultimately, in our present theory, is really just defined by a set of mathematical rules. It's really a mathematical structure. I mean, everything there is to know about an electron is encapsulated in a set of equations, and that's all there is to electrons. So it's like the deeper you go into matter, the more you're left with mathematics. And what is mathematics? Well, there's a whole field of philosophy asking what's mathematics, but you could argue that mathematics is a set mathematical idea. Well, mathematics is ideas. It's concepts. Okay. And you say the electron is basically, if I want to know what it is, it's this equation. And what's an equation? Well, it's something that exists in a mind. An equation exists in a mind, right? So I mean, you're ultimately sort of driven. When you look at matter, you're sort of driven. Matter is sort of based on ideas, and ideas, generally speaking, seem to be in or associated with mind. So I see how, like, the physical world is ultimately, actually, the famous astrophysicist Sir James Jeans, or physicist, said about 100 years ago, the more we understand the world, the less it seems like a great machine, and the more it seems like a great thought.
Right.
So the physical world is mathematics all the way down. So the physical world is sort of like a thought. And so I can see, so if matter is ultimately sort of a thought, and minds are thought, then you can easily end up with an idealist view that everything ultimately is from mind. But if everything is matter, then it's very mysterious how minds make an appearance. I mean, gets back to the qualia. If everything is just physical, then it's very hard to see how a bunch of physical odds and ends, just inanimate physical stuff, combined in various ways, suddenly is giving rise to consciousness and reason and free will and all these other things. So if I had to choose a form of monism, I'd be an idealist rather than a materialist. But I probably am neither. I think that they're both, mind and matter are somehow equally real constituents of the world.
Yeah, the Hare Krishna idea talks about a variety of ontological categories. So I wouldn't call it. It's not definitely not monism, and it's not even dualism. There's more energies than that even. And so the mind-body problem becomes absurd when you look at all these different energies, because it's like, well, they're sister energies and they're complementary, right? So, you know, I don't know. I find the mind-body problem weird.
I think there is a mind-body problem. So some of my Catholic philosopher friends get angry when I say that. You know, they have their own narrative of philosophical history, which I think is largely misses the point.
I mean, if they're sister energies and they're meant to interact, then why shouldn't they be able to interact?
I have nothing against. No, I don't see that as that's not puzzling, in that the mere fact that they interact. As I explained to people, I use an analogy, I think, in my book, someplace in my book. In physics, we can have two distinct kinds of entities that neither of which is reducible to the other. Take, say, electromagnetism. So you have one kind of entity which is charged stuff like electrons and things with electric charge, and then you have another entity which is the electromagnetic field. Electromagnetic fields aren't made of charged things, and charged things aren't made of electromagnetic fields. They're quite distinct, and you can't do without either of them. Yet they interact. And when people say, well, how does mind affect matter? Or how does matter affect mind? A lot of people who argue against mind as something distinct from matter, they think they have a slam dunk argument in favor of materialism by saying, you can't tell me how matter can affect mind or give rise to mind or anything. I mean, you have this matter and mind, people like me and maybe you talk about matter and mind as distinct kinds of things, but you can't explain to us how the matter affects the mind or the mind affects matter. And they're right. We can't explain that at the moment, maybe ever. But if you ask them, how is it that charges affect electromagnetic fields? Or how does an electromagnetic field affect a charge? They're completely distinct kinds of things. Why is one able to affect the other? Well, the best that you can do is to describe how the interaction, say, when the charged matter is doing such and such, it has such and such an effect on the electromagnetic field. That's what Maxwell's equations tell you. You can write an equation that describes that. And then you can say, if the electromagnetic fields are such and such, they have such and such an effect on the charged matter. And the Lorentz force law is an equation that describes that. You're not really saying how, in some way, the field affects the charges and the charges affect the field, the electromagnetic field. You're just stipulating that, in fact, they do. It's an empirical fact that they do, and we can describe it. In fact, they do. These effects are so regular and predictable that there's equations describing it. Well, I don't see why it's any worse to say, for a person like me to say, there's matter and there's mind, and they affect each other. I know that mind affects matter because I can freely will to pick up this coffee cup. And as my mind is affected, and matter affects mind. I can get drunk and my mind is affected by the alcohol. They clearly affect each other. Or the red light causes color sensations. How? I can't tell, but I can maybe the best we can do at some point is to point out regularities, rules about this. When certain kinds of physical things happen, they predictably have certain kinds of mental effects and vice versa. That's no different from what's going on in physics with the charges in the electromagnetic field. Maybe the best you can do is characterize the effects and describe them. But beyond that, what does it even mean to say, how does one affect the other? I don't know. I'm not even sure that's a meaningful question. Are they looking for a mechanism? See, I think that's the secret. The materialist has typically I have found, a very limited imagination. So materialist sort of unconsciously and almost automatically, unthinkingly, thinks of everything as if it's made of matter, and thinks of all processes as material processes, and all cause and effect as material cause and effect. He's looking for a mechanism. So when you tell him there's this stuff like consciousness, and then there's the brain, he wants you to explain how the brain gives rise to consciousness by conceiving of consciousness as a material thing, some ghostly material thing, an ether or something. And then he wants a physical mechanism by which he's conceiving of consciousness as itself a new kind of matter. And then he wants to see how the matter of your brain physically, by some physical mechanism with maybe gears and wires and ropes and stuff. He wants to see a physical mechanism with springs and gears by which this affects that, because that's what he's looking for. He's reducing everything to physics, and therefore he's trying to want a physical mechanism by which the physical brain produces consciousness, which he cannot help but conceive of as some kind of weird new kind of physical stuff. That's what I think is going on. But you don't have to do that. You can simply say they're distinct kinds of things that, in fact, we know from experience have effects upon each other. And that's a perfectly rational view.
Are you familiar with the argument based on microtubules, that the quantum processes and microtubules is where consciousness plugs into the brain?
I read Penrose, his book. I'm suspicious of that kind of thing. And I think neuroscientists have made arguments against it. Actually, a much more interesting set of ideas comes from a physicist who's now in his 90s, Henry Stapp at UC Berkeley. I'm sure he's retired now. And he has some sort of an idea. I haven't had a chance to read his book, but I think I understand the idea. Invoking the quantum mechanics, I think we maybe get a little hint of what might be good. If we ask, how is it that mind affects matter? That is a problem, not in the sense that it's unthinkable. I mean, some people say there's a problem, meaning something that's insuperable. You know, if somebody says, "We'll do this," and I say, "Well, there's a problem. I can't do that." It's not a. I don't think mind-body interaction is a problem in the sense of some insuperable theoretical objection to it. I think it's a question. How does that work in detail? So, how is it that when the equations are saying this, how is it that my active will can actually cause these particles, the electrons and the protons and so on, in my hand to do what it is that I'm willing them to do? How does that work? I think there may be a slight hint in quantum mechanics, because at least according to the traditional understanding of quantum mechanics, observers do have an effect on things. And I don't want to get into that. For those who want to know more about that, I have a YouTube video, and in my book, chapter 24 and 25, I talk about that. Very controversial subject, but I think it's generally understood that observers, in the traditional understanding of quantum mechanics, observers play a role in you can't really, in the traditional way understanding quantum mechanics, you can't talk about things without reference to observers who have to be knowers, as it were. You have to have minds, as in the traditional view. And I think that gives us a little hint of what might be going on and how it actually works in detail. But I don't want to get into that. It would take a long time to explain. But there's a book that just came out recently, like maybe a few years ago, by Henry Stapp. And if you know enough physics, then he has a theory about how this works.
I'll put a link in the description to the video you're talking about. I'll put a link in the description to the video you're mentioning where you explain quantum mechanics and consciousness.
But I don't get into how mind affects matter. But that video, I think, explains why observers are not reducible to physics. But I do recommend this book for those who have sort of a taste for physics, by Henry Stapp, and I wish I could remember. I think it has the word free will in the title. may have quantum mechanics in the title, but it's the most recent book written by Henry Stapp, Stapp. I think it's very interesting, and he may be on to
Quantum Theory and Free Will: How Mental Intentions Translates into Bodily Actions, 2017.
Yeah, that's it. Now, I can't endorse his conclusions because I haven't read the book. I've read the first part of it and sort of skimmed it, and I think I know what his idea is.
I'll check it out.
It's certainly worth considering.
Sounds like it'll be a good read. I liked the point you made about how, the materialists are asking this question of consciousness and, the mind-body problem. But how does, the rest of physics fare if we ask these same questions and we find we come into these things? So in a lot of worldviews, you'll find at a certain point, you've got to invoke inconceivability, or at a certain point, you've just got to say, I don't know any further beyond this. These are my explanations, and I don't have explanations for my explanations. And there's very obvious philosophical reasons why you need to do this, because if you required an explanation for every explanation, then you would spend all your time coming up with explanations.
You have an infinite regress. I mean, so this is a classic argument for the existence of God, which is many people have this very crude misunderstanding of what St. Thomas meant by a first mover. And this is interesting. I've had Catholics who heard the idea that there's a first mover, and what they think what that means is you have think of a game of pool. You have a pool ball move. Well, why? Because it was hit by another pool ball. Well, why did that move? Because it was hit by another one. And so you have a chain of pool balls hitting each other. And they think the first mover argument is that in that chain, there must be a first one that moved, like the first domino to fall. And that's not what, at least as St. Thomas understood it, that's not what he was talking about. And he explicitly says he's not talking about a sequence of events in time where each one is causing the next, and there has to be a first. He said he just saw no reason why you couldn't have an infinite sequence of events that extended infinitely into the past. Whereas the example he used is that a man is begotten by his father, who is begotten by his father, who's begotten by his father. And he said there's no philosophical or logical reason why that could not have been going on forever. And that shocks people who think they know what the first mover argument is, but they don't. It's really, St. Thomas really was thinking in terms of explanations, a chain of explanations. And so I think there's nothing wrong with an infinite sequence of events extending infinitely into the past. But if you want I think a better way to think about it is a mathematical proof. So in mathematical proof, you usually start with some unproven things, which are called axioms. Then you prove a theorem, and then another theorem, and another theorem, and you have a chain. So anything you've proven in some branch of mathematics, any theorem that you've proven it by a chain of reasoning going back to some axiom. Now, what if you tried to prove everything? Now, if you had a proof that didn't have a beginning, if you said, well, this follows logically from this, and this follows logically from that previous statement, and that follows from a previous statement, that follows from a previous statement, and that goes on forever, then you actually haven't proven anything, because the entire chain could be wrong.
Right, that makes sense.
In other words, a proof so there are certain infinite regresses you don't want to have. And what St. Thomas was saying, that if you're talking about explanations, there has to be an ultimate explanation. And I think it's better to think of maybe God in this way of thinking of God as sort of the ultimate explanation. One of the ways I like to think about God also is from St. Thomas Aquinas, but I learned it from a great Jesuit philosopher, very brilliant man, in a book by Bernard Lonergan. It's a very long book, so few people have read it. But I think this is a way of thinking about God. All of our ways of thinking about God are purely analogies. And we can't understand the divine nature because it infinitely transcends our categories of thought. And so as a traditional Catholic and Eastern Orthodox view and Christian view is that our knowledge of God can only be by analogies, and all of these analogies fall infinitely short of the reality of God. So even when we say God is a mind, Yes, but not a mind like our mind. It's infinitely different from our minds. Our minds are different from the mind of a grasshopper. So, but anyway, one way of thinking of God as an infinite act of understanding that understands and knows all things. It's a perfect, complete, infinite act of understanding. It comprehends everything. And sort of think of that time, those times when you have a blinding flash of insight. And suddenly everything makes sense, or everything in some little area makes sense to you that didn't make sense before. So the light bulb goes on, and now these things make sense. Well, think of God as that infinite light bulb, who if he has a flash of insight, in fact, by which he understands everything, and everything makes sense to him. There are no questions that he can't answer because he's an infinite, all-encompassing, all-embracing act of knowing and understanding. And of course, that act is God, according to the traditional view. God doesn't have an act of understanding. He is infinite understanding. And you could also say, but there's other ways of thinking about God as God is the infinite act of love, or God is the infinite life. He's like the fullness of life. I mean, you could describe him in different ways, which ultimately all are different analogies, as it were, for the divine reality, which we cannot grasp.
I get people, I make the arguments based on the kind of epistemology you give in your book that, foundational intuitionism, that we need true axioms to build our knowledge upon, and we have to accept those axioms as true based on them being self-evident or seeming to be true as best we can tell, with our intuition being tuned as much as we possibly can. And then from there, if we've got accurate axioms and if we follow valid chains of inference, then we can get knowledge. And people try to say, no, you can have false axioms. You can start with assumptions which you don't know to be true and later arrive at knowledge. And I just don't see how that can make any sense.
Well, I mean, if they're talking about the way empirical science doesn't deduce things. I mean, so in empirical science is not at all like mathematics. You don't deduce the truth of something. So that's not how empirical science works. You never deduce the conclusion. It's really what philosophers call inference to the best explanation. But let me go in a different direction. The people often ask is that this is what in the old days might have been called a schoolboy question, though I don't suppose we're allowed to say that. A school child question: who created God? But my oldest child, when he was 4, maybe less than 4, I think he was at most 4 years old. He was very small, and I was tucking him into bed, and he asked some pretty hard questions. And one of them was, well, who created God? And I was trying, I couldn't use a lot of metaphysics and philosophy on a 4-year-old. So I said, Thomas, I use this analogy, which I think is a pretty good one, and probably very traditional. So I said, look, Thomas, this thing is bright. This white thing, I'm holding it up, is bright. But why is it bright? Where does it get its light from? Well, it gets it from that light bulb. The light bulb gives light to this thing. But the light bulb is not getting its light from something else. It's its own source of light. It has its own light, so to speak. So this is reflected light coming from the light bulb, but the light bulb is a source of light. It has its own light. It doesn't need to get it from somewhere else. And I said, so we have being because it's conferred on us by God, who is the source of being. But God has his own being. He doesn't need a source of being. He has his own being. So he's sort of like the light, So that's the traditional view, is that God is infinite, is not something that exists. This book, this is my book, I brought it in case you wanted to ask me about it. This book exists, but it doesn't have to, it just happens to. And the idea is if something happens to be true but doesn't sort of have to be true a priori, then there must be a reason why it's true. So the book didn't have to exist, but it does. And therefore, there should be some reason why it does. But the idea is that God exists by necessity. He's a necessary being, the only necessary being. And therefore, he doesn't have to account for his existence. It is his nature to exist. It's the nature of God. God is, St. Thomas would say, existence itself.
Mm.
So it is the divine nature to exist. He is existence and doesn't need a cause of existence outside himself. And so that's really the answer. So again, that's where the chain ends. So I need a source of being, and I trace it ultimately back to God. But then I don't have to trace it further, and I don't have to go further back because he is the necessary being.
But
so
it's the same ideas in Hare Krishna theology too, that God is identical with his qualities and so on. You don't have God
right.
and then some other quality, because if God had a chair that was separate from him that he was sitting on, then is the chair superior to God because it's holding up God?
Well, God is not. It can't sit. The divine nature is not physical. So God.
We distinguish between physical and spiritual, but the spiritual has all the qualities that the physical has, but more, and they're in a more pure form. So in the spiritual world, there's still apples and oranges and people and dogs and pets, and you can run and chase and climb and frolic.
Oh, this is in your
this is the Hare Krishna view.
Okay. Now that we have a very different view of that. I should say that it's not surprising that I would say, and I don't mean to sound imperialistic or what's the right word? It's St. Thomas Aquinas once said that wherever you find truth, comes from the Holy Spirit, and so there is certainly true. I would say I'm saying this as a very traditional Catholic, and I say Orthodox by the Church's standards and anybody's standards of orthodoxy. But it's not that the Catholic Church has a monopoly on truth. In fact, there are some things where it is not on whether a particular theory of physics is right or wrong. The Catholic Church does not receive any special revelation from God about that. You don't go to the Catholic Church to find out whether superstring theory is correct. That you have to find out by what's traditionally called the natural light of reason. So God gave us reason. And so by our natural reason, we can arrive at a lot of truth, and even truths about God. And so the Catholic Church actually teaches, interestingly enough, that it is within the power of the natural light of human reason to know with certainty that God exists. That doesn't mean they don't mean that everybody can do that, because it might be very hard. I'm going to hang up this thing. But so it's not surprising to a Catholic anyway that other religions have arrived at a great deal of the truth about God.
Right.
And certainly that people who have arrived at a great deal of truth about the natural world, which in fact the Catholic Church doesn't have anything much to say about. So that is not. I would expect that, actually, if indeed our minds are capable of by their natural light of reason of attaining truth about God, I would expect other religious traditions to have gone some distance towards an understanding of God. The place where I may sound perhaps I don't know what the right word is, hegemonic or something. See, and we also think God can reveal things to people, who outside. There's what's called private revelation. The Catholic might receive a revelation from God that's just for that person, and that other people don't have to believe it. But we also believe that God revealed himself in a unique way in history, in the person of Christ, and that God actually took upon himself a human nature, so that Christ is in fact God, and that this kind of revelation, self-revelation, is unique and has not been repeated anywhere and never will be repeated throughout history. And therefore, this revelation has a certain definitive quality. And that's not to say that sages throughout history, in fact, many people thought that Plato and Aristotle, many Christians thought that God had inspired certain pagan thinkers with certain true ideas as a preparation for the gospel. So they saw it as part of God's providential design of it, that certain pagan philosophies had arisen, which had a lot of truth in them, which sort of paved the way, made it easier for the Gentiles, as it were, to understand the revelation. And also, not just that, but that they were actually necessary, some of these philosophical ideas, to explicate the deeper truths of revelation. You needed these ideas. And so that God reveals some of the truth to pagans and so on. And that would include you. So anyway, this is both ecumenical, I suppose, and not ecumenical.
Well, I mean,
but I would insist that there was, as a Catholic, I believe that there was. It's one thing to have somebody out there, perhaps under the prompting of the Holy Spirit, as St. Thomas said. Anytime someone says something that's true, in some sense, it is the Holy Spirit speaking. To say that there are people out there saying true things because of their deep insight, using the natural light of reason, perhaps aided by some inspirations from God, but that's not the same as what we think happened in Christ, where God sort of stepped into history in a unique way. I wonder, in your tradition, do you believe that there is a definitive and authoritative revelation that has been given that you can use as a touchstone, as it were, to judge things?
Yeah, we've got Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, which we take to be the, what do you call it? What's the Christian word? Inerrant word of God, so to speak.
The inerrant, right?
And
well, inerrant for Catholics doesn't mean quite the same as it means for some fundamentalist Christians. So we're not committed to a sort of biblical literalism, but so anyway,
we think there's some allegory in the Bhagavatam and whatnot, but in large part we take it to be describing accurate history as well as describing accurate, the deepest truths about reality and ontologies and whatnot.
Well, that makes your religion sound more rational, not true, but less irrational than I might have otherwise thought. Because you see, there are things that I think I can know by natural light of reason, but there are things that I think we can't know by the natural light of reason. So, for example, is going to happen to us after death? I don't think we have any empirical access to that. In spite of these near-death experiences people talk about. That's telling you that's near death, that's not death.
Yeah.
So I don't think we have or could have direct empirical access to what happens after we die. The only way we can know is by some revelation. And the fact I was giving a talk to a Catholic group just a couple of days ago, and someone was troubled, an older man, he says, how do we know that we're going to have a life after death? And he's made an interesting point, because I was giving a talk about the soul and why there are a lot of philosophical reasons to believe that we are not just reducible to matter. And he said, because let's say we have a spiritual soul, which he believed. Before I was born, he said, neither my body nor my soul existed. So why is it not logically possible that after I die, neither my body nor my soul will exist? And I said, well, that's sort of what Aristotle thought. Aristotle, I think, believed that there was an aspect of our minds that was not reducible to matter. It was the active intellect, is what it's called. But he thought that disappeared too, even though it was not reducible to matter. When your body dissolved, there was nothing left, nothing of you, no soul left. And I said, that's true. I think that the fact that there is something about our minds that is not reducible to physics at least makes it easier to believe that we might survive death. And if everything about us was reducible to matter, then it would be sort of hard to believe we survived when the matter was disintegrated. At least it makes it easier, but it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that we will survive. It just makes it a little easier. I said the only reason I believe that I will survive death is because Christ promised it. That's why I believe. And so I believe there's a basis for my belief, a rational basis. I think I have a basis for believing that Christ was divine. And if given that he's divine, then if he tells me that I will not perish upon death, then I have a rational basis for that belief. What bothers me about some people, I won't talk about your religion, but there are people out there who have speculative ideas about the afterlife. But it's not based on a revelation. I mean, I think even some of those religions don't claim that there was a revelation. And yet they talk about survival after death. And I wonder, how do they know? If it's not revealed by God and it's not empirically knowable, and it can't be proven by logic, by pure philosophical reason, how do they know? If it's not self-evident and it's not empirically knowable, and it's not been revealed, then you have no basis ultimately for believing it. And so that's why I feel those religions who talk about an afterlife, or even give a lot of colorful and detailed descriptions of it, where they don't claim to have a revelation from God, I think it's irrational. It's just wishful thinking. But you tell me that you have a revelation, so I think more highly
Right.
than I otherwise would have.
I can make one point from a scientific reasoning point of view. So if you have a hypothesis that has what did Einstein say? Make your theory as simple as possible, but no simpler. So if we have a simple theology which can explain reality and explain other religions and why they get the results they get in people's personal lives, and it's also simple, then maybe we have the more true theology than the one that has less explanatory power.
Exactly. That's what I was talking about earlier. And from what you say, the inference to the best explanation. So it just happens in science. So in science, you don't start with axioms and deduce by syllogistic reasoning results. What you do is you have, as you say, you have a set of hypotheses. And if they have a lot of explanatory power, and a few relatively simple hypotheses explain a vast amount of a vast number array of things, and it's coherent and beautiful and so on. It has then you tend to believe it so yes, I think that also is how we know things in religion. I believe, and so I think that what you do is you have a set of hypotheses, as you say, and if they have a lot of, I think Catholicism, I won't speak for other religions, but I think monotheism, and I think specifically Catholicism, have a lot more explanatory power than, say, materialism does.
Yeah, for sure. But I would say that Vaishnava theology has more explanatory power, specifically in regards to other religions. So, like, we understand that like, when Buddha came, there was a lot of sinfulness going on, and they were following the Vedas, but not properly. They were just sacrificing animals, but they weren't doing it properly. So the animals were actually being killed. Whereas when you do a proper animal sacrifice, it's a test of the potency of the mantra. The animal goes into the fire and comes out with a new body, and there's no violence involved. So they were just abusing animals and so on. So Buddha came and said, throw out the Vedas, forget all this. Just, you're suffering. Here's how to stop suffering. And, just be compassionate, basically. So it's described in Bhagavatam that Buddha was an incarnation of Krishna, who's God, who came to teach sub-religious principles. And then later Shankaracharya came to reintroduce the Vedas, but he kept the same philosophy because it's a gradual process to get back to Vedic monotheism. And then later Madhvacharya and Ramanujakarya came and gave Vedic monotheism. And then, God has created this material world to give us a capacity to come back to him while giving us the opportunity to exhaust our material desires so we can have our little apartment where we can try to be king for a day and try to, explore our material desires and take birth in a variety of forms and explore all those desires. But while doing that, he's also giving us the opportunity to turn back to him. So that's why you'll get aspects of spiritual knowledge and different calibers of spiritual knowledge, and different saints and prophets have come all through history, all over the world, to give some knowledge. And depending on the audience, if you're teaching math to 5-year-olds versus if you're teaching math to university students, you're going to give a different kind of teachings. And I know with some things in physics, they teach people in high school one thing, and then when you get to second year university, they're like, actually, we just taught you that stuff because it has some explanatory power and simpler, but actually it's not quite true. So in a similar way with theology, you might get a higher level where it's like, it's not that the other stuff before wasn't true, it's just that there's a deeper layer to it that kind of goes beyond that. So, yeah, I'm
not going to engage in a debate with you.
Yeah, I wasn't actually planning on having this conversation.
The relative credibility or the grounds of credibility of different religions. I mean, there are obviously analogs. I mean, between what you're describing and the way that Christians, Catholics would think about certain things, for example, though not, I mean, there are parallels, shall we say, certain analogies. So, for example, when you said, you teach something to a small child, and then later you give them a fuller and more adequate account that they would not be capable of understanding at an earlier level. Well, there's an unfolding of revelation, according to the Christian view, where you had, of course, all of the Old Testament revelation, which proceeded in stages. I mean, you can see, and modern scholars say that within the Old Testament, you can see a deepening or a gradual development of their concept of God, and it reaches though there are sort of mysterious things that happen rather early. So when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush, and he says, "I am," when Moses asks God, what name, when I go back to report to the people of Israel, what name, who shall I say that has been talking to me? Who are you? What is your name? And he said, "I am who am. Thus shalt thou say unto the people of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you." So God says, tell them, "I am hath sent me unto you." So now, of course, looking back, we understand, the theologians understand this to be in a very profound sense, that God is existence. He is this, and Jesus said, God is this eternally existing being. And it's very striking that in John's Gospel, at one point, Jesus says before Abraham was, I am, using the present tense. So anyway, there's a profound meaning there, which may have escaped the people at the time that those verses of the Old Testament were written, but in the fuller development of understanding, the deeper meaning was recognized. But we see a development theologically, even within the Old Testament. And so, and the idea is that you can't, that it has to be done in stages, precisely for the reason you said. You can't start with a small child and give them everything at once. You have to lead them to it progressively. So there are parallels there.
One final point on that is that the caliber of the teachings are contingent on the relevant to the caliber of the student. So in India, Sri Chaitanya came 500 years ago, and he had as some of his main followers the greatest theologians, the greatest scholars in India at the time, such as Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami and so on. And then when Jesus came, many of his followers were farmers, and in the area at the time, the philosophy there wasn't anywhere near as sophisticated as the philosophy that you found in India 500 years ago. But anyway, I didn't mean to get into
well, actually, it's not polemics. So, I mean, it's interesting that a lot of the theology, this is something that maybe some Protestants don't realize, because they certain books of the Old Testament they reject for these complicated reasons. But the later books of what the Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox recognize as Old Testament, they are Jewish books. They were written in the, let's say, in the couple of hundred years before Christ. And as they say, the Catholics, Eastern Orthodox recognize them as part of the Bible. And the early Christians, certainly, it's clear that the early Christians also recognized them as inspired. They actually have very sophisticated theology in them, and you actually even see explicit influence of Greek in some of those books, like the Book of Wisdom, for example. But anyway, so actually, some of those books were written in Alexandria, Egypt, by Jewish authors who were, in some sense, responding to the challenge of Greek science and Greek philosophy. And so it was kind of a Jewish response to these pagan ideas, and but there was also influence there. So I mean, it was formulating the revelation in terms that it was written. Some of these books were written in Greek, and they were written for educated Greek-speaking people. That was the language of educated people at that time in the western half of the Mediterranean, eastern half of the Mediterranean. It was the language of culture, and it was trying to make Jewish ideas sort of accessible using these Greek and metaphysical categories. So that's actually, Catholics see that as a stage in the unfolding of revelation. So, but anyway, one thing that I think I want in making these comparisons. So the way that the Catholics understand this, and the Eastern Orthodox too, and some Protestants, that the church is so God became incarnate. So God's desire is to unite the human race with Him and to reunite it. So sin divides people from each other, divides people from God, and even internally divides people. We're not really fully whole because our sinfulness sort of has a fragmenting effect. So God wants to restore the unity of the human race with itself and with Him, and to have a union which is regarded as a nuptial union, really. So the imagery in the Bible is that God is like the bridegroom and His church is the bride. And just as two become one in a bodily way in marriage, so God and man are united. And this happens in the church. It first happened in Christ Himself, who was both divine and man fully. So their divine and human were united. But that incarnation is extended throughout history in what's called the mystical body of Christ. So the church is, in some sense, a generalization of that. The church is the body of Christ, in which, as people are added to the church, they become united to Christ, and His body grows. This union of God and man is growing, as it were. But a corollary of that, which, as I say, the Catholics and Orthodox believe, is the church actually, in a sense, the church speaks with the authority of Christ. It is His mystical body. And just as Christ, when He was on earth, as one human being, He spoke with a human voice, but He's also speaking as God, but using human language. So it was God speaking through the human. But that continues today because the church is God speaks through His church. And that's why Jesus says, he who does not hear you, He's saying to the apostles, he who hears you hears me. And he who rejects you rejects me and the one who sent me. So he confers. Essentially, the church is teaching and doing the things that Jesus did. Now, of course, it's filled with imperfect people. So, but nevertheless, the church is regarded as having, just as Jesus is God, the church, which is His body, has a divine authority. And so the church is continuing to speak Christ's words in every generation. And so if I ask myself, who's right on some theological question, I don't have to sit there and study and say, what are the relative merits of this view or that view? Because ultimately, I have the living voice of the church, who is as expounding revelation, interpreting it, and guaranteeing that it is being transmitted faithfully. And I don't see that which East is there an Eastern religion? So you say, well, there's this Buddha was, incarnation, and this wise person here, and that wise person there, and that wise person. Not all Hindus would agree with your brand.
Oh no, they won't all agree. That's for sure. But
No, and
historically,
is there some brand of Hinduism? Is there some brand of Hinduism that says we're not just right about more things than you, but we have, as it were, we can point to not only that there was an incarnation or a divine revelation, but we can point to the fact that this body, this living, existing, contemporary body, is the authentic and authoritative interpreter of the revelation. Because I can say Jesus, said things like he picked apostles, and we know that later these apostles picked other people to be bishops, and that there was what we call the apostolic succession. He found that there was a body of believers then which has continuously existed since Christ's walked the earth. This body has continuously existed, and you can trace the teachers. This bishop was ordained by this preceding bishops, ordained by preceding ones, and these can be traced back to the apostles themselves. And so, there's some sort of historical, empirical. Now, it could all be nonsense logically. You could say that Christ wasn't God or didn't leave a revelation. But if you believe that Christ was divine, he actually had a very good system set up of not having people pouring through a 2,000-year-old book and trying to figure out what it really means, because we know what that led to. Because you have thousands of Protestant denominations arguing about every verse of Scripture. So he had a much more plan that there's a living, breathing body of people who are endowed with his authority to interpret. Is there something analogous, or do I have to read all the different schools of Buddhism and Hinduism and figure out for myself which one is the right one?
It's a good question. That the problem you're getting at is a good one to ask about. So we have what's called parampara, which roughly means disciplic succession, and sometimes people call it a technology, but it's a principle of succession of how the knowledge is passed down. So just as, if you wanted medical knowledge to be passed down, you would hope that a doctor learning how to do heart surgery was learning how to do heart surgery from somebody who had himself successfully performed heart surgery. So in a similar way, you want to pass spiritual knowledge down through people who have successfully applied the spiritual knowledge and gained realization. So there's what's called gyan and there's what's called vigyan. So gyan is knowledge. So, if you explain, here's how you, change a heart, you cut here, put a new heart in, that's gyan. But until somebody's actually done that and done, open heart surgery successfully, they don't have the same kind of realization of that knowledge. So in a similar way with the spiritual knowledge, you hear, this is God and these are his qualities, and here's prayer, and here's how you connect to God, and here's how you purify your heart and fall in love with God. Until you've actually purified your heart and fallen in love with God, it's gyan. And then when you have vigyan, then you're qualified to be a guru, because there's this verse in Bhagavad Gita that you should approach your guru humbly, render service unto him, and inquire from him. And it says the self-realized souls can impart knowledge unto you because they have seen the truth. And the disciplic succession comes in that you have guru passing on to disciple. And if somebody's a good disciple, only then are they qualified to be a guru. So if somebody puts their hand up and says, I'm a guru, come and learn all this knowledge from them, the first question is, who's your guru?
Right.
Where are you getting your knowledge from?
That's the thing. I'm not trying to score points. I'm just telling you why I would be personally. I'm very concerned with epistemology.
Yeah.
That is, I like to know what I know, how certain my knowledge is, and on what basis I make assertions. That's why I say, if somebody asks me, are you going to be, will you survive death in some fashion? I I know why I say I will, because as I said, because Christ promised that, and for other reasons that we've not time to go into, I think that Christ is who he claimed to be. And so, but I'm always attentive to, how do I know? I drive my wife nuts because she'll say things in everyday life, make a statement about somebody, something happening or something. And I'll say, how do you know that? Was it because somebody said it to you? How trustworthy was that person? And she gets annoyed because she thinks I'm doubting her veracity. I'm just really wanting to know, what is the rational basis? How much can I rely on it? Where does this information ultimately come from? So I'm very concerned with this, and that's why I find Catholicism, that satisfies me, because I understand. Now, you can always say, how do I know that the church is what it claims to be? You're always confronted by a claim, and you have to decide whether that claim makes sense. You say you have a hypothesis, and then you have to see, is that hypothesis self-consistent? Is it coherent? Does it make sense? Does it explain a lot of things? But you always start with a hypothesis, which is just put out there, and then you have to try to figure out whether you should believe it, based on all sorts of evidence and its explanatory power. Well, in religion, I think you're ultimately also based with some claim. And so in this case, it's claims about, is Christ who he said he is? Is the Catholic Church what it claims to be? And for me, that's the fundamental claim. You have this living thing that exists, and that has existed for 2,000 years, and that has made consistent claims over those 2,000 years. One of the things that's quite astonishing, many Christians who are not Catholic are quite astonished when they go back and read early Christian writings, what I call the early church fathers, from the first 4, 5, 6 centuries of the church's history. They're astonished at how consistent what they were saying is what the Catholic Church says today. The church has an astonishing consistency of its message through history. And I'm confronted with this. And the church is making claims about itself. It says we were founded by Christ, and we are the mystical body of Christ, and Christ authorized our teachers. One of the things that they said in the temple when Jesus was preaching in the temple, they said he's not like other prophets. He teaches with authority. See, Christ had claimed an authority for himself that no other prophets had claimed before that in Jewish history. And Jesus would actually repeat things that were said in the Old Testament and said, you have heard it said, or you have read that. And he's quoting scripture, and he says, but I say. And so he's teaching, claimed for himself divine authority. He taught with authority. But he also, it's clear in the New Testament, conferred that on certain people. And the famous statement he makes to Peter, what you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, and so on. He said to the apostles, if you forgive men's sins, they are forgiven them. If you hold them, so he conferred authority, and now there's this living institution claiming the same authority. Well, they're not claiming to be God, but claiming to be his voice in the world. And I'm confronted with that, and I say, okay, I know why I believe what I believe, because once I've concluded that church is what it claims to be, that doesn't mean I check my brains at the door, because the church doesn't claim to have answered all theological questions. There's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of theological questions the church has not definitively taught anything about. The theologians and Catholics argue about all the time. But there are some that I don't have to debate, because the church has sort of authoritatively taught them. And it's like science, the experiment comes along, and that's it. You can use the results of that experiment as a basis for further development, and in the same way, when the church does, on rare occasions, definitively decide a disputed question and say, this is what we have always believed, and this is a departure from what we've always believed, that in some sense resolves the question, and you can move on and make further progress based on that. What I see among other religions is a welter of competing claims. None of them really can historically claim plausibly to be the appointed They may say, we are. If you are spiritually deep enough, you will see that we are teaching what the Vedas taught or something. No, but they were. Is there a living guru who can claim an unbroken claim to have had authority given to him in an unbroken chain? That there's a historical continuity and that he has authority to teach, not just because he's deep and wise, but he has some sort of teaching authority.
So my trouble with the Catholic Church answer to this problem is that its strength, I would say, comes based on the quality of the guru-disciple succession. So if at some point in history the Catholic Church was no longer populated with people who had realized the knowledge, and the people were actually just holding the positions but weren't actually that God conscious, I would say the whole thing would come undone, even if they still held the institution.
That's an interesting thing, because bishops are not regarded as being holier than anyone else. In fact, the people who have the deep insight into the meaning of the revelation are the saints. And the saints and the bishops are not this. There are some bishops in history who were saints, but the vast majority weren't. And there's some saints who are bishops, but the vast majority weren't. There's actually an interesting scene that people, I don't think, understand the symbolic meaning of, many people, when they hear it read. In John's Gospel, when the apostles hear from the women that the tomb is empty, that the tomb that Christ was buried in is now empty. And so two of the apostles, Peter and John, run as fast as they can to the tomb to see for themselves. And there's an interesting subtle symbolic scene. John is generally regarded as the more profound. He was the disciple who Christ loved. He's described in the New Testament as the one who Christ loved. He was the most intimately close to Christ. And he, of course, wrote, and his disciples wrote much of the New Testament. He's often called John the theologian or John the evangelist. So John the divine. So he's sort of the most profound, in a sense, among the apostles by far. But Peter was the one who had sort of the authority, sort of in the legal sense, because Christ made him the head of the apostles. He didn't choose the most profound. He chose Peter, who maybe just an ordinary guy. So what happens, they run to the tomb, and John gets there first because he's younger and runs faster, but he doesn't go in. He stops and waits for Peter to go in first, and to first be the first witness of what's there, and then he goes in. And I think that symbolizes the fact that at any given time, the Pope and the bishops may be dunderheads. They might be idiots. They might not be holy at all. They might be sinful. They might be actually rotten human beings in some cases. In many cases, they have been. But they have the authority. And we believe that if they speak the truth, not everything a bishop or pope says is authority, is binding. Not at all, not by a long shot. It's a much more complicated thing, but at least it's But the body of bishops collectively, we believe, when they intend to definitively settle a question, which doesn't often happen, but when a question has to be resolved because it's tearing the church apart, then we believe the church, through its bishops collectively, and sometimes through the Pope as the head of the bishops, can make a definitive resolution of the conflict by settling a question for the sake of the unity of the church and the authenticity of its teaching. But that's not because they're smarter than everyone else. They will consult the smartest theologians they can find. We believe ultimately they're reliable because the Holy Spirit, because God promised that the church would not go astray as a whole, that he would not allow the church to go astray on fundamental things as a whole. So it's God's promise again that he would do that. It's not. I don't trust the church because I think it's populated. The bishops are especially smart. I don't think they are especially smart. I trust the church because God made a promise about the church that the gates of hell would not prevail against it, or the gates of death would not prevail against the power of the underworld, however you want to translate. He promised that the church would be a reliable guide, not the particular bishops, as he said, referring to some of the Jewish leaders of his day. He said to his disciples, they sit in the chair of Moses. So do what they say, but not as they do, because they were hypocrites. So they sit in the chair of Moses, so do as they say, as they teach, but don't follow their example. And that's how it is. We think that these appointed teachers, some of them go astray. Some of them teach heresy, but we believe collectively they don't. And only because of God's made a promise to that effect. I'm not going to trust any set of men.
Has the church taught heresy at points in history?
No.
No. So really here we're coming back to
that's what's like, I would say there's a test there. Now you could say, at least one can say that the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, to a large, the difference is actually in theology about like 0.1%. But you can go back and there's a consistency of its teaching through time. Now, as I said, you can certainly believe that all of its teachings are utterly false, but at least they've been consistent I can know what the church teaches, and I've also investigated this, and I know that it's essentially, there's been development. There's certainly what's called development of doctrine. The teachings are understood more deeply, expressed more in fine detail, formulated more carefully. The questions that had never arisen in the past have arisen, and then in order to resolve a question, you have to further elaborate on the unfold what the teaching implies, and so on. There's development of doctrine, but there's a consistency. There's no time in which the church authoritatively and in a definitive way taught X in a way and said, this is faith. You must believe this. X is a matter of faith. And then later, they taught as a matter of faith that you had to believe something logically inconsistent with it. If I thought that had ever happened, by the way, there are ways to know. The church lets you know when it's teaching something as a matter of faith. Not everything that they teach they claim to be a matter of faith. But when they intend to make something a matter of faith, they let you know that very clearly, and there are ways to know that. And if I thought that there was something that had clearly been taught as a matter of faith at one time, and then at a later time something inconsistent with it was taught as a matter of faith, I would stop being a Catholic at that instant.
Right. So, I mean,
I can't believe a theory that's not consistent with itself.
Yeah. So really, we're just getting here to a theological difference, because your argument from here really contingents on Jesus said this would be the case. And I can't really argue with that. That's axiomatic for you, and for me, it's not.
Well, that he said it is certainly recorded in Scripture. Now, you could argue about the veracity, whether it was a mistranslation or did he actually, the historical Jesus, say this, or was it just somebody invented this and put the words in his mouth? There's all sorts of ways.
I'm not qualified to comment on
certainly
that.
He does make statements that imply the church has authority. And that there's statements of other people in recorded Scripture that shows that they thought the church taught with authority. I mean, for example, in the book of Acts, after Christ's death and resurrection, they're trying to solve a big dispute that arose among Christians. Some thought you had to follow the Jewish law and be circumcised and follow the whole Jewish law. And others said, no, you didn't. And that was tearing the church apart. And the apostles gathered. And at the end of that meeting, they said, it has seemed good to us and to the Holy Spirit that you should do this. That's pretty bold. Imagine if a pope said that today. It's my decision and that of God.
Yeah.
There'd be an uproar,
yeah.
Especially among Protestants. The Pope is claiming to be God. But this is what the apostles said, essentially. They said, our decision and that of the Holy Spirit, they said, is this. And so it's clear they saw themselves as carrying on, as having been invested with teaching authority. And that's what I don't see that same thing happening.
So we do have that. So we have parampara, so there'll be guru, and it goes all the way back. And every now and again, the teachings may become, corrupted, or the disciplic succession become a little weaker, and then Krishna appears, and then later same thing happens, and Sri Chaitanya appeared 500 years ago, and even since then it becomes a little weakened. And then what you might call super gurus, we call them Acharya is someone who teaches by example, and then a Bhagavad Acharya is like a super Acharya. So we can call them super gurus, and every now and again one of those come. And you can tell a super guru from an ordinary guru because there's just certain qualities of their consciousness and their intellect which excel other human beings. And like there's certain auspicious markings too, like Bhaktisiddhanta, when he was a baby, he was held up to the Rathayatra cart and the garland fell over him. He was born with his umbilical cord wrapped around him like a Brahmin thread. And there's certain sort of like markings that indicate that. And like we know Krishna's God because there's all these supernatural feats that Krishna performed, like lifting Govardhan Hill on his finger. And
well, that's interesting because that parallels what the Catholic Church would say. So you see, if it required, I don't want to check my brains at the door, but as I said, I'd like to know, just like as a physicist, I want to know what the experimental data is. And my theories could be beautiful, but they have to fit the data. You know, nature, it's not how smart the physicist is. I don't listen to a physicist because he's an especially smart physicist. No, of course, that makes a difference. It's what nature ultimately is the one who teaches. So you have a brilliant theory about electrons. And the guy who proposes is way smarter than these other people. But the verdict is not who is the smartest physicist. It's nature gets to have the last word because you do an experiment and nature says, I'm sorry, but your theory is wrong because it doesn't. As somebody said, science is about beautiful theories coming into contact with ugly reality. So that's the point. I don't want to have to say who is the holiest guru. I'm not holy enough myself to know that. Who is the most profound theologian? Well, maybe even if I were a very profound theologian myself, most people aren't profound theologians. You can't expect the man on the street, the average guy, to go around and say, here are the gurus. This is the guy who's the holiest and the deepest. How would they know he's the deepest unless they themselves are very deep? And that's asking too much of people. And so that's why
I don't think it is. I think
that's why the church says there are objective signs that and like you say, with there's miracles or something that attest to this.
Yeah.
And that's why, for example, we say, the way people knew Christ, one way they knew he was divine is not only by the profundity of his message, so that's the main thing, but also because he performed miracles, he healed people and all this, and raised Lazarus from the dead and so forth. And so you need sort of external signs that people can recognize.
Yeah.
And I don't have to say the bishop of my diocese, I know he's a deeply profound guru. No, I say, I know he's the bishop, and I can tell he's the bishop because he's recognized by the church as the bishop. And I know if I investigated, actually their website, so you can do this, I can see who ordained him and who ordained the guy before him and so on. And I'm morally certain that he can trace the ordination all the way back to the apostles. So, and that's something the man on the street can understand, that they don't have to go out and do a profundity test to figure out who they should listen to. That's asking too much, it seems to me. It's an elitist thing, that there's a small group who are especially profound and they're in the know.
Well, your thing's elitist
and not
too.
only in the know, they know which other people are in the know. And they know that these other guys aren't as deep as they are. But that's a kind of esoteric knowledge, which is not going to be helpful to ordinary people.
I mean, there's measures of it too, like a degree of compassion, the taste for the holy name, and the desire to serve other people who are God conscious. But like your thing might be simpler, like, I don't have to think, I just go to the church. But if it doesn't actually
on fundamental,
it's simpler. But if your premise isn't true,
you're right. Yeah.
Like simpler is good. It's good to have the simplest theory possible, but no simpler. So your theory is simpler, I'll grant it that. But if your premise is false, then it's too simple.
Right. I want to say it's not that I don't have to think. It's just I don't have to think. Not every question is always an open question. So just as in physics, we don't revisit the question of whether oxygen has 8 protons in the nucleus or 7. That's a settled question, settled ultimately by experiment. So you can't make any progress unless you can settle certain questions. And so there are ways of settling. That doesn't mean, just like we know certain things in science, there's settled questions, doesn't mean we've stopped thinking. On the contrary, in a sense, the more we learn, the more questions arise. And so it's the same. As I said, there are countless theological questions that deep and that people debate and argue. And so it's not, and not only that, but even things that are settled questions, just understanding what they mean. What does it mean to say God is love? What does it mean? What are the doctrines that we know? What do they mean? Trying to understand what we know. As St. Augustine said, we believe in order to understand. It's not just we believe and then okay, don't have to think anymore. We know the answer. No, we want to understand the answer. We want to have a deeper penetration into the meaning of the answer and what it entails and how all these different truths fit together. So there's a lot of intellectual work and room for speculation and investigation and reflection. But not every question is constantly, we're not always pushed back to square one. Now, if somebody comes along and says, well, you've always taught that divorce and remarriage is bad, or that that fornication, sex outside of marriage. Well, let's open that question. Is it really true? Well, we don't have to go back on every question to square one. Some of them are settled. Yes, fornication and adultery are wrong. It's not an open question anymore. It doesn't mean we don't have to think. There's a lot of moral philosophers and theologians sit around and say, well, how do we understand why these things? We take it for granted that adultery is wrong. Why? Let's come up with a way of understanding these moral teachings more deeply. And so John Paul II had this whole thing called the theology of the body, which was a very elaborate, deep set of philosophical understandings of sexual morality, why certain things were wrong. And so it's not that we don't have to think. It's just you don't have to always go back to square one and start from scratch.
We can have something similar too. So let's suppose the Catholic Church went off the rails and you noticed that the current leaders of the Catholic Church were teaching something different. So you've already said you'd abandon the church at that point. And then suppose there was some other group
only if they taught it as a matter of faith.
Yeah. So it's just a thought experiment.
It contradicted something that had been taught as a matter of faith.
So let's suppose, they go off the rails as you define it. But then there's another group of Catholics who are teaching the same thing Catholics have taught all through history. And you can see, they're living the teachings. They're teaching the same thing. Every intuitive and empirical marker shows they're living the word of God the way it's always been taught as far back as you can tell. Would you not just say, okay, I'm going to follow this lot then?
Well, by the way, it's not the question whether they're living the word of God, because I think there are people who are not. There are people outside the Catholic Church, say Protestants, who are much holier than a lot of the people in the Catholic Church. So they may be living the gospel much better. It's just that they're not authoritatively teaching it. So again, so what would happen in that case? Well, logically, I either have to leave the Catholic. Now, I don't think I would be attracted at that point. I don't think I would say I'm going to take up with this other group of Christians. Well, there's a lot of such groups. They're called Protestants. That's what they say. They say the church went off the rails.
Yeah,
that's exactly what they say. They say that on a fundamental point, certain fundamental points, by faith, they were saved by faith alone, and certain other things.
I mean,
the Catholic. And so the point is, would I then go up with a different group of Christians, even if it seemed to me that those Christians seemed closer to what the church had historically taught than what the present church is claiming to authoritatively? No, I wouldn't. I'd probably lose my faith in Christianity at that point, because it wouldn't pass the other tests, precisely because Christ promised that wouldn't happen.
Right.
That is, the idea that there would be a small group that didn't have the authority to teach, that were actually teaching there are such people, for example. It's not hypothetical. Vatican II made various changes in the church's practice, and some people thought in the church's teachings that were irreconcilable with tradition. And so they split off. They're called traditionalists, and so on. And they think that they are carrying on the authentic Catholic Church, and that the Pope and the rest of the bishops in the world are not. Well, that to me is illogical. I mean, that's not, that can't happen.
Well,
according to the original hypothesis, according to Catholic theory.
Yeah. that comes back
If
to
you're in schism from the Bishop of Rome and all the other bishops that are in communion with him, you are a schismatic. You are not. You aren't. There can't be two churches at once, and you're not it. And at that point, I would lose. If it turned out that I couldn't understand, it was absolutely clear that the Church, Catholic Church, in union with the Pope, were teaching heresy, which I think cannot happen. That would make nonsense of everything that I believe as a Catholic.
Because you
probably lapse into.
You take that premise to be that axiomatic premise to be core to your whole faith.
Yes, in fact, St. Augustine said at one point, which would shock some people, he was one of the greatest thinkers of the early church after St. Paul. He was probably the greatest thinker in the first 1,000 years of the church, if not more. He said, I would not believe the Holy Scriptures if it was not for the authority of the Catholic Church. So he's writing this around 400 AD. He says the reason he believes in the Scriptures is because the Catholic Church has told him that the Scriptures are inspired. So for him, that was core. That was core.
Right.
Because that's what you're confronted with. In actual historical fact, what you are, a person living in the year 2020, is not confronted with a book lying there, written in Greek, in ancient Greek. You're confronted with the church making claims here and now, and that's what you're actually meeting. And even the people who say, "Well, where did the Bible come from?" Jesus didn't sit down and write the New Testament. The Bible, actually, the New Testament emerged within the church, various figures within the church.
Right.
John, St. Paul, and others wrote various parts. And at some point, these were all gathered together by the church and said, these are sacred scriptures. So the church, the Bible, the New Testament emerged within the church, is a fruit, as it were, of the church. And it's the church that tells us that it's this word of God and so on. So they're actually sort of epistemologically, you start with the church and the church says, here's the Bible.
Yeah, right.
You should believe it. That's what actually happens in every case.
So
even for Protestants, the Protestants may think the Bible fell down from heaven, but actually their pastors are the ones that taught them that the Bible is inerrant and all these other things and salvation by faith. I mean, they're also following a tradition. And in reality, that's what's always going on, is that you're confronted with some living tradition.
So we don't have the problem you're describing because we have a consistency of teachings through time. So you look back through all the different acharyas, you see every one of them is teaching the same thing. And maybe one of them introduces a new understanding, but it always adds to the old understanding. It's never a contradiction of what's been taught before. And like Srila Bhaktisiddhanta is definitely accepted as a, within the Vaishnava circles as a great guru. And then Srila Prabhupada was, there were certain indications from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta that Srila Prabhupada was, a really special disciple. And then he went on to found the Hare Krishna movement in the West. And a lot of his statements are taken as authority, but you look through what he's teaching and he's just repeating the words of the previous acharyas. So you get this consistency going back. So if you find someone saying something new and you look back and you find it's a contradiction, then you can question that person. But when we have this disciplic succession going right back where we can show there's no contradiction. And also, like I said, there's certain qualities, like it's said that like nobody can spread God consciousness who isn't empowered to do so. So Prabhupada's ability to spread the Krishna consciousness movement all over the world and open so many temples and distribute so many books is proof that he was empowered to do so.
Okay, well, I mean, you have a theory, and it's I'm glad that it has certain parallels.
Yeah. Anyway, we're not going to agree on this. We can.
That's one of the reasons I believe what I believe. I am very care how the grounds of belief. I very much care about it. So I respect. Wait a minute. Oh, my wife is asking me to do something.
We should probably wrap it up.
We're probably past. No, we're 2 hours now.
Yeah. We're past it. There was two questions. I don't know if we've got time to quickly do them. I told one person I'd do it. I don't know if you can quickly. Can you see it? Oh, hang on. No, not that one. How do I get it? There we go. Can you see it? Oh, hang on. Why is it not on top?
Do you have an Aristotelian view of causation? Would you consider yourself a dualist or a non-dualist or something else? What is an observer in your sense of quantum mechanics? I think there's some truth in Aristotle, but I don't regard myself as an Aristotelian. I have a lot of problems with aspects of Aristotelianism, especially when it comes to its understanding of the natural world. But there are other aspects of Aristotelianism that I think are profound and true. So, I mean, some of it I take and some of it I leave. Would I consider myself a dualist? Well, I do only in this sense. I think that matter and mind are distinct entities, neither reducible to the other. They affect the other. Each effect can affect the other. But I'm not a dualist. The kind of dualism that's bad from a Christian point of view is the dualism that says, for example, there's several kinds that the Christians and Catholics would reject. One is that says that matter is evil and spirit is good, and that the soul is trapped in matter, that it's a bad thing that we're embodied, that our souls are united with matter, that's bad. We'd be better off if we weren't. No, that's by God's design, and the body is good and the soul is good, and they belong together. And they're not extraneous to each other. The body is not the prison of the soul, as some, So that kind of dualism we reject. Also, the idea that the body and the soul are sort of extraneous to each other, and that there's sort of these two entities that really don't belong together, and they're sort of forced together, like stapled together. No, I'm not a body and a soul. I am one person who has both body and soul, but the church teaches what's called psychophysical unity. Bodies, we are one unity. We are not two substances, as the Catechism says, the human being is not two substances joined together, but one substance composed of body and soul united. So there are kinds of dualism I reject, but that matter and spirit, that matter and mind, in particular matter and spirit, are distinct and not reducible to each other. That, not dualism, but as St. John Paul II said, there is a certain duality. This is an exact quote. There's a certain duality in the Christian understanding of human beings. What's an observer? Look at my 40-minute video. An observer in quantum mechanics is some part of the physical world. I mean, it's somebody who learns about the physical world by interacting physically with it. It is somebody who makes measurements and observations. So it's a being in this world who's learning about the world through physically interacting with the world. So that's what an observer is.
There's one more.
Well, I use symmetry as an I'll read it. I remember Barr's exposition of symmetry in nature as an eye-opener for beauty in nature. How does symmetry inform our metaphysics, if it does at all? Well, I mean, I use symmetry as an example, as one kind of beauty and one kind of order in the world. So an ancient argument is that the early church writers used all the time was that the world, you need to believe in a creator because, one, the world exists and there must be a cause of its existence. And second, it's orderly. And there must be as St. Irenaeus said in the second study, a giver of order. There must be a reason that the world is orderly. This is something atheists don't seem to ever think about. They try to explain everything with the laws of physics, but if you ask them, why are there laws? Why are there laws? Why are there laws of nature at all? Why is there order in the world? Well, the traditional theistic view is that God imposed this order. He is a giver of order. He's a lawgiver. And he made the world beautiful. And that beauty of nature reflects God's beauty, because God is not just truth, and God is not just life and love, and so God is also beauty. God is beauty itself. And so St. Augustine said in one of his prayers, late have I loved you, beauty, ancient, ever old, ever ancient and ever new. Talking about God, he addresses God as beauty. Late have I loved thee, beauty, ever ancient and ever new. So God is beauty, and the beauty of the world reflects the beauty of its creator. It reflects divine beauty. So actually, there's a book by your friend and my friend, David Bentley Hart, who is a friend of mine. called The Beauty of the Infinite, I think. So I think beauty leads us to God. In fact, for Christians, there are three sort of transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. All of them lead us to God. And I think it was Solzhenitsyn who said that there are these three trees that reach up to heaven: truth, goodness, and beauty. And the modern world has managed to cut down two of them, the truth and the goodness, but the beauty will, he says, will save us because that's still there. So
No.
it's
And the Bhagavatam, it's mentioned that there's four pillars, four religious principles: truthfulness, austerity, cleanliness, and usually when there's lists of things, I cannot remember one of them, but it said that.
But cleanliness I don't see, because there are some very holy people who are dirty.
No.
Or dirty wearing rags and filthy, diseased people, but they could be much holier. Probably.
The holy people traditionally in India, even if they were living on the street, would still be very clean. They'd bathe multiple times a day and so on.
Well, it's not a Christian idea that cleanliness is next to godliness. That's certainly
compassion
not
was the other one. No, compassion. Yeah, so compassion, truthfulness, austerity, and purity. And it said the only one that's left standing in this Kali Yuga is truthfulness. All the truthfulness, compassion, cleanliness, and anyway, I've already listened. The other three, I'm bad at this kind of thing.
I remember so I answered all your questions.
Yeah, those were the questions.
To the best of my ability, and anything I said that was stupid, I don't claim to be a guru. I'm certainly not holy, and I don't claim to be profound. I'm a physicist by trade.
Yeah. I was planning on talking about
the physicist's view of the faith.
Well, you're clearly no stranger to theology. You've definitely done your homework on it. So,
but I'm not an authority on it.
Yeah.
So go read the Catechism of the Catholic Church if you want to know what the Church says. And if I said something different, you should listen to Catechism and not me, because I may have garbled something up.
Right. I was planning on getting into the arguments based on quantum physics and had some questions on the double slit experiment and whatnot, but we'll have to save that for another day.
We can talk about that another time.
Yeah, cool. All right, thanks. We'll wrap it up here. Thanks for tuning in. We've got more of these streams. Be sure to give us comments. Let us know what you think. And if you like this kind of thing, hit the subscribe button. Hare Krishna. Where's the outro?
Bye, everyone.